Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. I got another philosophical video for you guys. I'm going to be discussing nominalism. So while this video is primarily going to be about nominalism, because as far as I know I would consider myself a nominalist, so this video is going to be something that attempts to defend nominalism in contrast to the overall debate between nominalism versus universalism. So the topic that I'm going to be going for is jumping off basically on that, whole like debate. So I'll define the terms for a lot of you that might not know what I'm talking about. Nominalism is basically, well, consider this. When you call something nominal, it basically means that it only exists in name. It just exists purely on the label in which it is being called. It has no actual existence other than the reference of the said thing, the label, the name itself. So this is an issue in contrast when you consider something like universalism, which I don't think I would have to explain honestly, because it's exactly how it sounds. Basically, universalism is there are universals, there are categorizations that you can make and sort out and organize things. But the difficulty with that, when you consider a nominalist perspective, is that nominalism, if I can like sum it up real quickly, a lot of definitions are basically there are no such things as universals whatsoever. There are only such things as particulars. Now, that might sound kind of strange and unusual because it is not typically how we normally operate as human beings. We want to think that there is predictability. We want to assume that there is some sort of like categorization and organization that we can make. But I think there are good things to consider as to how nominalism can hold itself up rather than our intuitive bias to just assume that there are such a thing as, arbitrary categorizations and abstracts, as we can call it. So I'll just be, heading in all sorts of directions to say, okay, if nominalism does sound absurd, perhaps the things that I say in this video could make you at least consider it a little bit and see how it, makes more sense. Because I acknowledge that the nominalist perspective might be more unusual than somebody that leans towards being a universalist, and I get it because kind of like what I would even acknowledge, it's our bias as human beings to, let's say, like generalize or make overall models of predictability and I guess you could say archetypes, even if you're like Jungian, let's say. But basically, to explain why I would consider myself a nominalist, I would consider one thing. If you've ever heard of basically mereological nihilism, I have already spoken a little bit about that on this channel. If you find my video about mereological nihilism, I used mereological nihilism to basically debunk, which I think it does debunk, basically the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. Whatever begins to exist supposedly has a cause, blah, blah, whatever, all that kind of stuff. So basically, mereological nihilism in a nutshell, when you consider it, okay, mereology is basically the study of parts. Now, nihilism is essentially the annihilation of any sort of form. So, mereological nihilism in a nutshell is basically that there are no things with proper parts. Things are basically made of mereological simples, things that cannot be divided whatsoever. So I think this is our bias as human beings to assume that things are not made of mereological simples because we want to assume that we can navigate and sort out the world. But I would argue that this is only a uniquely like thing that occurs within the mind. Abstract objects do not actually exist. I think even by the mere like definition of it, if you say, which I already think is a contradiction, that there are such things as abstract objects, let's say God, let's say morality, let's say numbers and whatnot, that already contradicts with the definition. You're not even talking about something abstract then. Well, I suppose you could say you are talking about something abstract, but I think like the interpretation of what something means to be abstract is incredibly wrong. Because basically, as a nominalist, and I think I've made it clear on this channel, I am an empiricist, I would say. A lot of people who are nominalists are often linked with empiricism. And yeah, it makes sense because basically we're going to be in denial of things that are basically quote unquote abstract and whatnot. And the reason why I'm, okay, You can say picking at like semantics, whatever. A lot of people will say that philosophy is just picking at semantics in general. But basically, if an abstract thing is something that is just defined within thought, within name, within label, it cannot exist outside of a human's as outside of a human's, like projection of the world itself. It is not a feature of the world itself. It might be something that contains within us, but it has no objective empirical basis in the slightest. So, for example, you can take mathematical nominalism, which basically is as it sounds. Basically, numbers are abstract entities. The reason why is because we use them for a categorization, a way to basically, sort out and, make an understanding, quote unquote, of like an amount. But if I say something like, okay, define what five is, if you say, oh, for example, $5 or five pieces of gum, you can talk about those things that are more concrete. Well, what is the relevance of five? I'm asking you, where exactly do you find five in five pieces of gum? I don't have to deny the gum's existence, even if we're going to take it like more simplistically. Let's like take away the mereological nihilism and just make this more simple. I mean, again, if you consider mereological nihilism, maybe you can even like bite the bullet and just suddenly jump to ontological nihilism, where you would just consider that nothing might even exist after all. Perhaps that's another video that I have to, further expand upon better. But no, this video is primarily going to be about the divide in philosophy between nominalism and universalism. So if I ask you to define five, you don't have anything along with it if you do not, pair it with something that is more empirical and something with, like more observation. So basically, the reason why this is a flawed thing to say that numbers are inherently real is because basically, well, consider, let's say, like the problem of induction. Maybe this isn't the best example even for like me to use, because, like, for example, I still question the problem of induction, to be honest, despite being a pretty skeptical person like myself, and I do like David Hume's idea of like the is ought thing when it comes to like morality. So this sort of thing does kind of like sound similar. But I think like the only issue that I have with it though is that I'm still not entirely sure how I define my perception of time philosophically. And the problem of induction basically does, like go on the basis that okay, just because something happened a particular way so many times in the past, how do you know that it will universally always occur that way? So you can see, I think, why I would be using it for like this case, but it's just to put things like in perspective. Maybe that's not like a like definitive stance on like the problem of induction, itself, because like again, I guess the argument you can make against it is that basically, okay, if the future does not actually exist, then the past and the present always have to, interact based on the model in which we understand the past and the present. But anyway, going back to the issue between nominalism and universalism, basically the thing that I want to say, because I know that a lot of people who consider a more like universalist perspective, because like, I'll be honest, it is easier in day-to-day life to assume that there are such things as universals, there are such things as like commonalities. And a lot of people, for example, might take, Plato's idea of forms to like, venture out that basically there is a higher end of like universal. So basically, for example, the blackness of this and the blackness of my hair. Sure, these are separate things, but the blackness is universal in the sense that it exists in some kind of like higher form that bestowed upon the blackness here and the blackness basically like on my hair. That's like a quick rundown. I mean, more or less. It might not be perfect, whatever, but like basically that's like a quick rundown. If you believe in Platonic forms, you believe that like all forms basically have like a higher, like I guess like let's say like sustenance and source towards, everything else. But nominalists actually can tackle this. And I think they do it quite well because if you ask a nominalist, basically, like, okay, why is it that we think there are universals despite the fact that, like, there actually isn't? And this goes to a specific kind of nominalism, which I think is, like, super interesting. Basically, trope philosophy. So if you understand what a trope is in layman's terms, like think about it as like basically like a sense of style, a sense of or I don't know, let's say like genres for like movies and like TV shows. There are tropes and archetypes being followed. So basically, similar patterns being bestowed upon unique entities, essentially, or let's just say particulars in more of like the nominalist sense is what I'm referring to. So, for example, you could ask me if you take a more like universalist approach that like, okay, if there's no such thing as universals, how can I identify that this is black and my hair is also black? But the bigger question, which I think nominalists, raise against basically universalist that I think is super well. How do you know that this blackness is not its own blackness to contain this blackness, and the blackness on my hair is its own unique blackness, its own particular to itself? So basically, this black and this black can look the same in the sense that you and I can understand that it's black. But how is it that you know that just because they look the same, they actually are the same? And that's where we basically neatly would categorize this as basically like a trope. This is a trope of what's considered black. My hair is a trope of what's considered black. And basically, all things are a trope of things that might appear as though they are the same thing, but are actually not the same thing, you know, in the slightest. And honestly, the reason why what like committed me to being I guess like more of like a nominalist is when I was considering epiphenomenalism, like I guess like more in depth. I did make a video about that, and you could simply just watch that if you want like a better explanation than perhaps what I'm about to give right now. But in a nutshell, basically, epiphenomenalism, in basically the philosophy of perception, would argue that basically your mental properties do not affect at all how the world actually works and operates. Basically, it's not a fully like Cartesian like perspective where, oh, you might take like a solipsist view and be like, oh, only I exist. It's not necessarily saying that. I love the thumbnail that I used for my epiphenomenalism video because like if I'm like breaking that down, basically this is exactly how it works. So essentially, we exist in the universe. Basically, us, our brains, our mechanism of perceiving information exists within the universe, but our brain exists where our mind is. So trying to understand the universe is only accessing the mind's perception of the universe. So no matter how hard you try to understand the universe itself, you are only getting a trope depiction of the universe. And I'm saying trope in this regard because I think that's where I'm like relaying the whole like epiphenomenalist, oh, you can't know anything about like the physical like the universe, whatever, or basically like anything outside of yourself. Even if we grant that the thing outside of ourselves is something that like truly exists, and like again, we don't necessarily have to take like a full on like solipsist view and say that like okay, only like we exist. If we grant that that still exists, we don't know how it actually works. And when you consider it, I think this is primarily why we have like, human conflict to like, begin with, because everybody exists on a trope. Everybody is perceiving the same reality, but that reality is a trope of how they understand that reality. So, despite so many contradicting philosophical ideas we have, like religious atheists, like whatever, and like stuff like that, we only see a trope of this universe that basically exists within us. So, all categorizations do not actually make sense because again, considering mereological like nihilism, where is it written down that the universe actually has to make sense to us? I'm saying the universe making sense to us, not for us. We desire the universe to make sense. And I think that's why a lot of people falsely believe in a God. People falsely believe in like a creator because they demand the universe to have like a sense of organization, but it doesn't. Organization exists within us. So a lot of people might say, for example, oh, even if humans didn't exist, two plus two will still equal four. From like a very like nominalist perspective, I think you'd argue like, no, it wouldn't, because without human beings, the question two plus two wouldn't even exist to begin with. So even somebody getting that question wrong, two plus two equals like 37, the mistake wouldn't even occur because the question wouldn't even occur. There is no basis to assume that anything needs actual categorization. There's no basis to actually assume that anything actually needs any sort of like predictability other than the fact that we need it for our own comfort. And I guess because we all do it, I can't, like blame anybody. But despite how practical it might be to, be a universalist and assume that there are things with categorizations and easy generalizations, all of that is abstract because they're mental properties. And kind of like what epiphenomenalism is basically talking about, mental properties are not guaranteed to actually align with the universe itself. Even if you happen to be, let's say, like the smartest human being that like just knows how like the objective outside world evidently exists, again, I still don't think that this takes away from like the nominalist point of view that like basically it is still a trope. You can have a trope of the objective truth basis of reality itself, but not the objective truth based reality itself that is actually, itself. So I don't know if I'm forgetting to like put in like anything else, but I think that's more or less enough for you guys to start like thinking about this whole like nominalist versus like universalist sort of like issue. So, give me your thoughts. Tell me if you agree with me. Tell me if you don't agree.